The winter of 1899 did not freeze Kansas, just it froze the hearts of the survivors. Outside, the sky was gray and snowed for weeks. The temperature plummeted down to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow piled high enough to completely cover the roofs. For more than 3 months, the people of Hayes were nearly buried alive in the icy cold. But the cold was not the worst of it. In a large warehouse on the edge of town, the Parker brothers' warehouse, something even darker than winter was taking place. When spring finally arrived, as the snow melted and the ground began to reveal what had been buried, investigators discovered something strange. The county's death records were seriously flawed. According to the papers, more than 300 families were recorded as having died because of the harsh winter. But only 47 bodies were buried in the town cemetery. The rest disappeared completely. Not a trace of blood, not a grave, not a footprint in the snow. What? The Parker brothers burned in the industrial furnace that winter? Wasn't just wood or coal. It was evidence. Evidence of the most massive and cold-blooded crime in Kansas history, cleverly disguised as Christian charity and community service. Before we dive into the terrifying truth about Thomas and Samuel Parker, you need to know this. The documents you're about to hear once sealed for more than a century, rotting in the flooded basement of the Hayes County Courthouse. No one thought they existed. And once you know what I'm about to tell you, you'll never look at winter the same way again. If you're a fan of true crime stories that blend fact and legend, you've come to the right place. This is Sleepy History Tales, where mysteries never sleep. Where are you listening from? Leave your state below. I want to know how far this story goes and who's stepping into the darkness with me. The story begins in Hayes, Kansas. 1899. A small railroad town of about 8,000 people, close-knit, proud of their Christian faith and mutual aid. The Kansas Pacific Railroad passed through, helping the town prosper. Settlers poured in, opened stores, built churches, established banks. The town grew like a healthy heartbeat in the wilderness. But just 30 miles west, and you found something else entirely: the empty land. A land with no boundaries, no laws, just lonely mud houses in the middle of a snowy plain. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, the Parker brothers arrived in Hayes in 1894. They brought money, ambition, and a perfect business plan. Thomas, the older brother, was tall, thin, with prematurely gray hair, a cold, piercing gaze. He looked at everything as if he was sizing it up. Samuel, the younger brother, was shorter, stocky, with hands roughened by work. He always smiled, but strangely the smile never reached his eyes. They bought a large warehouse on the edge of town. Then they began a job that sounded humane, cleaning up the aftermath. Whenever a family died in the open field from illness, accident, or frostbite, the Parkers would show up. They collected the bodies, buried them, took inventory of their belongings, cleaned out their homes, and prepared them for the new occupants to move in. In an age where death was commonplace and resources were scarce, their services were almost saviors. The people of Hayes praised them for their dedication and discretion. They kept the dead from being forgotten. They carried them to the funeral, instead of making their loved ones walk through 10 feet of snow. But no one asked, how did they do it so fast? Why was there always smoke rising from the Parker warehouse? Even when the cold wind could kill a man in minutes. And that was when winter ended and hell began to unfold. Remember the Parker brothers? They had 2 heavy wagons, a few seasonal workers, and most importantly, one of the largest incinerators in all of Kansas. Initially, the furnace was used to burn things that couldn't be recycled, like moldy carpets and broken furniture. The villagers trusted them, the undertakers, the cleanups, the crisis responders quietly and kindly. But then, as autumn retreated in November 1899, it took every ray of warmth from the land. The blizzard came early. So cold that the old Hayes said they had never seen ice form on their windows so quickly in their lives. Sarah Henderson, the telegraph operator, wrote in her diary, "The windows froze in a few minutes this morning. I have never seen anything like it so quickly in my life." On November 18th, the temperature dropped a full 30 degrees overnight. By morning, the town square was nearly half a meter thick with snow. The wind whistled through clothes, through bones, making outdoor conversation meaningless. The railroads were shut down. Supply trains from the east had stopped coming. Families living out on the prairie were completely cut off. But the Parkers were not. They were surprisingly well prepared. Their warehouses were stocked with cold-dried food and warm clothes. The furnaces were adapted to use all kinds of fuel, and they had the only means of transportation that could move across the snow and ice, a specially reinforced homemade sled. The first people knocked on the door of Parker's warehouse in early December. They came asking for food, coal, or simply a place to stay out of the cold. Thomas and Samuel opened the door with kind smiles, handed out blankets. Hot porridge offered help. But then, their employees began to sense that something was wrong. Mary Kellerman, the town's recorder, recalled. The 2 men kept coming to her office in December, asking for details about inheritances, land titles, and procedures for transferring property without relatives. They said they were just preparing for the winter to pass and needed to process a series of estates. Mary thought they were being overly considerate. It was only years later, looking back, that she realized they were hunting for land. They began visiting families on the prairie. They brought flower wood and gentle greetings, but according to records found decades later, those visits were often the last time the family was seen alive. On December 14, they arrived at the Kowalski's house 12 miles north of Hayes. 3 days later, the house was deserted. No one inside. No blood. No footprints. No note. Parker told them to take the family to Missouri. But no relatives in Missouri. No one ever saw them again. That Christmas, it was a chilly 38 degrees below zero. Hayes residents began to leave or disappear, but the Parkers' furnace never stopped. It burned red all night, and every day it belched thick black smoke into the gray sky. The smell from their barn was strangely unpleasant. A sweet, pungent smell, like burning flesh, but not quite. The smell clung to coats, lingered in the nostrils, and made one dizzy. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town doctor, tried several times to approach. Each time he was politely but firmly stopped. Parker said they burned the diseased remains from houses where people had died of the disease. Rationally, the doctor had to accept, but he wrote in his medical notebook, "That smell is not like the smell I have ever encountered from any disease." New Year's Day, 1900. Just 2 months ago, Hayes had been a town of 8,000. Now, Fewer than 2,000 remained. The rest or flee the icy hell, or disappear into the Parker brothers' never-ending furnace. Remember, I said it from the beginning. This story isn't just about the weather. It's about greed disguised as kindness. It's about fake smiles, knowing you don't need a gun to kill. All you need is paperwork and a big enough furnace. Do you still want to continue? Send in the next part. I'll continue uncovering the truth with you until the night gets too quiet to sleep. When asked about the mass disappearances, the Parker brothers replied simply, they died of cold, or they left for warmer climes. And while the town was still in confusion, they took on the responsibility of handling more than 40 vacant lots, working day and night, clearing houses, collecting property, getting ready for new settlers. It seemed like such a kindness was priceless. But some observant residents began to see things that were hard to explain. How did property change hands so quickly? How did valuable items from the homes of the dead appear in the Parker warehouse just days after they disappeared? And how did they always know which family would disappear next? The first person to raise questions was Mrs. Janet Thornfield, a middle-aged widow who lived in the center of town. She ran a small boarding house for 20 years. She knew every family within a 50-mile radius of Hayes, and she had a remarkable memory. As the winter grew colder, Janet began keeping meticulous records of every name listed as dead or gone. Her files, discovered in 1962 while renovating the old boarding house, revealed an unbelievable truth. According to the records, the Parker brothers reported 43 deaths in December and January alone, from elderly people to toddlers. But Janet remembered clearly, many of them were healthy and well-stocked just days before. The Brennans, for example, stopped by Janet's on December 20th. Mrs. Brennan bought groceries, smiled, said the family was prepared for the winter even, looking forward to a time of rest together. But 5 days later, Thomas and Samuel Parker reported that the Brennans had frozen to death. When Janet asked to come and pay her respects, they replied gently. The body was so badly decomposed, buried, and the story repeated itself. The Williamsons, the Krause, and dozens of others. Every time Parker had a good excuse, they handled the funeral professionally. No one suspected anything except Janet. And then, what she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. The night of January 15th, 1900. Janet was walking past Parker's barn when she heard voices inside, not loud, but decisive. She quietly approached, peering through a crack in the wood. Inside, a family, a father, a mother, 2 small children stood by the furnace. They were clearly bewildered, afraid. Thomas Parker whispered something, coaxing, explaining. The child asked softly, "When will we be able to go home?" Janet waited for almost an hour. The family never came out. She only heard the furnace door open and close and the sound of heavy objects being dragged. When Janet looked again, only the Parker brothers remained, silently putting each material into the furnace. The next day, Janet quietly inquired. The description of the other family matched exactly that of the Hendricks. The people Parker had reported dead 2 days ago also frozen to death in the house. When she expressed her doubts, they just smiled. "You must be wrong. Worrying too much will fool your mind." But Janet was right. She began to closely monitor the brothers' activities, recording the times, directions, the number of people coming and going, the smell of smoke, the noises at night. And what she discovered was far beyond a typical estate agent. Parker didn't just take advantage of the winter, they created it. They hunted people like profit-seeking merchants. They picked their targets, isolated families with wealth, few relatives. Then they showed up with firewood food offers of help. The more they took, the more dependent the family became, the easier it was to control. Meanwhile, Parker had learned every nook and cranny of inheritance law, property law, and paperwork. They had people inside the government, knowing in advance when the government will confiscate transfer ownership and transfer ownership. And when the time comes to end, they invite the whole family to the warehouse under the pretext of meeting relatives or signing land papers. And then, all the doors are locked. When asked about the mass disappearances, the Parker brothers replied simply, they died of cold, or they left for warmer climes. And while the town was still in confusion, they took on the responsibility of handling more than 40 vacant lots, working day and night, clearing houses, collecting property, getting ready for new settlers. It seemed like such a kindness was priceless. But some observant residents began to see things that were hard to explain. How did property change hands so quickly? How did valuable items from the homes of the dead appear in the Parker warehouse just days after they disappeared? And how did they always know which family would disappear next? The first person to raise questions was Mrs. Janet Thornfield, a middle-aged widow who lived in the center of town. She ran a small boarding house for 20 years. She knew every family within a 50-mile radius of Hayes, and she had a remarkable memory. As the winter grew colder, Janet began keeping meticulous records of every name listed as dead or gone. Her files, discovered in 1962 while renovating the old boarding house, revealed an unbelievable truth. According to the records, the Parker brothers reported 43 deaths in December and January alone, from elderly people to toddlers. But Janet remembered clearly, many of them were healthy and well-stocked just days before. The Brennans, for example, stopped by Janet's on December 20th. Mrs. Brennan bought groceries, smiled, said the family was prepared for the winter even, looking forward to a time of rest together. But 5 days later, Thomas and Samuel Parker reported that the Brennans had frozen to death. When Janet asked to come and pay her respects, they replied gently, the body was so badly decomposed, buried. And the story repeated itself. The Williamsons, the Krause, and dozens of others. Every time Parker had a good excuse, they handled the funeral professionally. No one suspected anything except Janet. And then, what she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. The night of January 15th, 1900. Janet was walking past Parker's barn when she heard voices inside, not loud, but decisive. She quietly approached, peering through a crack in the wood. Inside, a family, a father, a mother, 2 small children stood by the furnace. They were clearly bewildered, afraid. Thomas Parker whispered something coaxing, explaining. The child asked softly, "When will we be able to go home?" Janet waited for almost an hour. The family never came out. She only heard the furnace door open and close and the sound of heavy objects being dragged. When Janet looked again, only the Parker brothers remained, silently putting each material into the furnace. The next day, Janet quietly inquired. The description of the other family matched exactly that of the Hendricks. The people Parker had reported dead 2 days ago, also frozen to death in the house. When she expressed her doubts, they just smiled. You must be wrong. Worrying too much will fool your mind. But Janet was right. She began to closely monitor the brothers' activities, recording the times, directions, the number of people coming and going, the smell of smoke, the noises at night. And what she discovered was far beyond a typical estate agent. Parker didn't just take advantage of the winter. They created it. They hunted people like profit-seeking merchants. They picked their targets, isolated families with wealth, few relatives. Then they showed up with firewood food offers of help. The more they took, the more dependent the family became, the easier it was to control. Meanwhile, Parker had learned every nook and cranny of inheritance law, property law, and paperwork. They had people inside the government, knowing in advance when the state will confiscate, transfer ownership, and when it's time to end, they invite the whole family to the warehouse under the pretext of meeting relatives or signing land papers. And then, all the doors are locked. Their furnaces are designed to burn at extremely high temperatures. Not only do they destroy bodies, but all the evidence rings, bookstalls, hand-embroidered scarves. The genius and the scariest is they do it all under the guise of a legitimate business. No one suspects that Parker's warehouse has a lot of stuff, because they're the ones who take care of the funeral. And while the town slowly melts under the snow, the evil still burns in the furnace. We are simply burning diseased and unsaleable material the Parkers always maintained. The stench emanating from their warehouse, they said, was nothing more than the rotting wood and old fabrics of abandoned houses. According to Dr. Edmund Hartwell's medical diary, found in 1978 during the winter of 1899-1900, he was never invited to examine any of the bodies Parker claimed to have found. He was simply told the body was destroyed by frost or disease and is not fit for autopsy. This was highly unusual for a physician charged with determining the cause of death for insurance and legal reasons. Meanwhile, the brothers developed a highly efficient system for disposing of their victims' belongings. They sorted through the victims' belongings, keeping valuables, burning anything that could be traced. Every item that passed through their hands was meticulously recorded in an inventory, which was then presented as a legitimate sale or recycling of scrap. But most viciously, Parker penetrated his own mind. In Thomas Parker's letter, he described the brothers' work as a benevolent act, saving his family from a slow death by starvation and frost. And Samuel's diary was filled with assertions, "We are doing a public service. We only want to save them from their misery." By mid-January 1900, the temperature had not risen above 20 degrees F for more than 3 weeks. Haze was virtually isolated. The courthouse was covered in snow. The railroads were shut down, and communications with the state were virtually non-existent. It was at this point that the Parker brothers reached their peak of efficiency. "We've taken care of over 60 vacant lots," they proudly declared later. The number was mathematically impossible, but the smoke and desolation of winter hid all traces. They prioritized the wealth of their families, relying on land records, livestock numbers, stocks, etc. Then they forged transfer papers, completing transactions in days instead of weeks. Their warehouses operated 24/7 furnaces were constantly blazing, and workers were constantly coming and going. The brothers also recruited people who were often underfed and underclothed, promising free beds and meals in exchange for carrying things. Among them was Frank Collar, who later testified he carried bundles of clothes belongings, even infected bedding into the furnace. But Frank also noticed many of the items were still new, including personal mementos that no family would leave behind. Frank said, "There were rooms in the warehouse that we were not allowed to enter. There were shifts that required everyone to leave completely. That was the secret of the crime, operating under the cover of a legitimate service, but destroying people and their documents in the same fire. Do you feel cold?" It wasn't just the temperature. It was the bone-chilling cold of greed and concealed crime. In the next part, we will explore how the truth is finally revealed, and the survivors are left with only one question: will justice be warm enough to melt this ice? The Parker brothers had an explanation for everything. They claimed their warehouse restrictions were merely precautions necessary for handling contaminated materials or processing estate documents in private. But to Frank, their quiet assistant, the truth would dawn too late. Those were the exact hours when the furnace roared the loudest, when no one was allowed near, when the scent of smoke wasn't of paper or pine, but something heavier, something wrong. The Parker operation was disturbingly precise. Every lie had a footnote. Every disappearance had an alibi. They forged letters from fictional relatives, crafted farewell notes in trembling imitation of the victim's handwriting, and even sent updates from families who were supposedly thriving in St. Louis or Topeka. They staged grief like theater, with Frank unknowingly building the props. And yet, all it took to unravel it was a child's toy. February the 14th, 1900, Valentine's Day. The sky was iron grey. The snow had crusted over into a silence so complete it pressed against your ears. That afternoon, little Emma Schultz, bundled in wool, too big for her tiny shoulders, was poking at a snowdrift near the warehouse when she found it a small wooden horse hand-carved with two initials on the underside: PB. Peter Brennan, 6 years old, supposedly dead. Emma didn't understand, but her mother did. Mrs. Schulz had seen Peter clutching that very toy just days before the Parkers claimed the Brennan family froze to death. It was his treasure. He never let it go even when he slept. And now, it was here, in the snow, behind the Parker warehouse. That night, Mrs. Schultz paid a quiet visit to Janet Thornfield, the local school teacher who had for weeks been keeping private notes and quiet suspicions. They compared memories, names, patterns. Too many deaths with no funerals. Too many families fleeing in the dead of winter without a single trace. They realized something no one wanted to admit, and they knew they couldn't go to the sheriff. Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, no relation to Peter's family, was drowning in crisis. The snow had turned their county into an island, and he was relying entirely on the Parker brothers for updates. The judge was snowed in 20 miles south. State authorities buried under a dozen emergencies across Kansas. So they turned to each other. Janet, Mrs. Schultz, then Dr. Hartwell, who had long been uneasy about never seeing a single body, and Mary Kellerman, the courthouse record keeper who'd grown increasingly disturbed by the speed and convenience with which estates were transferred to the Parkers for safekeeping. This unlikely alliance began to meet secretly at the back of the schoolhouse beneath the broken bell. Each brought pieces of a puzzle no one dared name out loud. Dr. Hartwell, with his medical knowledge, pointed out how impossible some death reports were frozen lungs in temperatures that hadn't dropped low enough, cases of sudden fever with no symptoms observed. Mary brought deeds transfers, property claims that had been filed before the deaths even occurred. Janet tracked the brothers' movements, noting their late-night visits to homes that were declared empty by dawn. And Mrs. Schultz, she carried the weight of names and faces. She knew these families. She remembered who baked what for Christmas, who borrowed eggs, who had a baby due in March. Together they built a timeline, a quiet, damning map, and all roads pointed back to the warehouse. The furnace, the odor, the patterns, the secrecy. They didn't want to believe it. No one ever wants to believe that people who bring blankets and food might also bring death. But they had a choice: wait for spring and hope the thaw would bring the state authorities, or act now, before another family vanished. The decision was made for them. The Parkers were seen packing their sled for a visit to the Kowalski homestead, one of the few isolated families still alive, last heard from in early January, February 22, 1900. Janet Thornfield and Dr. Hartwell followed them into the white silence, far enough to stay hidden, close enough to see. The Parker brothers arrived around sunset, smiling, waving, bringing dried goods and kerosene. They were welcomed warmly. After weeks alone, any human face was a blessing. Hours passed. Janet and the doctor waited beneath the trees, breath fogging in the moonlight. It was almost midnight when the front door creaked open. The Parkers stepped out, and behind them, the Kowalskis emerged too. Not just the parents, all three children, alive, carrying bundles wrapped in shawls, looking tired but ready to travel. Janet's breath caught. A moment of hope bloomed. Perhaps they were taking them to safety. But the sled didn't head toward the town. It didn't go near the church or the infirmary. It turned quietly toward the warehouse and never turned back. To be continued. The family was led inside and the door was bolted shut. Dr. Hartwell and Janet waited from a distance, hidden in a nearby grove of trees, watching the warehouse flicker with orange light from within. Hours passed. The Kowalski family did not re-emerge. No sounds of movement. No silhouettes at the windows. Only the furnace roaring louder than usual, belched thick smoke into the icy February sky. As dawn broke across the Kansas plains, Hartwell and Janet could no longer deny what they had witnessed. The Parker brothers had not saved the Kowalski family, they had taken them. They rushed back into town without rest, their faces pale with urgency. The time for patient documentation had passed. There was no guarantee how many more families might be next. That morning, February 23, 1900, the small group of citizen investigators gathered with resolve. Hartwell, Janet Mary Kellerman, Mrs. Schultz and three others approached the Parker warehouse together not as neighbors, but as accusers. Thomas Parker greeted them at the door, composed as ever, dressed in his usual heavy coat and scarf eyes unreadable. When asked directly about the Kowalski family, he answered without hesitation they were ill. He said malnourished and suffering from frostbite. He and Samuel had taken them to relatives in Junction City the night before. but his confidence only made the group more suspicious. He had ready answers for every question. Why no one saw the family leave? They had taken the back route. Why the furnace burned so late? Supplies had frozen and needed sterilizing. Why the Kowalskis left behind their belongings? Allegedly too frostbitten to carry anything. But then, Dr. Hartwell noticed something small and damning. Blood. Dark rust-colored stains on Thomas Parker's shirt cuff, partially hidden beneath his coat sleeve. When Hartwell pointed it out, Thomas barely flinched. "Butchering livestock," he said, with a nod for communal storage. It's not a crime, doctor, but Hartwell knew better. He'd performed enough autopsies to tell animal blood from human. The color, the viscosity, it wasn't right. And it wasn't livestock that had bled onto Thomas Parker. The group demanded to search the warehouse. Thomas refused, citing contaminated materials and private medical documents. But the excuse fell flat. Janet stepped forward, shaking with anger, her voice cutting through the cold. "You're hiding something in there and we will find out what." Knowing they could go no further without authority, the group turned to the one man who could help Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan. At first, Brennan hesitated. He was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the winter crisis and had relied heavily on the Parkers' records. But faced with mounting evidence, personal testimonies, forged documents, and now the missing Kowalskis, he relented. It was enough for a forced inspection. 2 days later, on February the 25th, 1900, Brennan, accompanied by Hartwell Janet, and 3 armed volunteers arrived at the warehouse. Thomas and Samuel were not present. The group entered by breaking the heavy lock. Inside, the truth unfolded, meticulously organized and almost impossibly vast. The warehouse was divided into functional sections, as if it had been designed not just for storage, but for erasure. The main chamber resembled a macabre museum, hundreds of personal belongings laid out in rows. Dresses, boots, spectacles, toys, even Bibles. All carefully tagged, some with names. Brennan recognized a scarf that had belonged to Mrs. Klein, a woman reported dead from pneumonia weeks prior. Her body had never been seen. Further in, the group found records. Stacks of folders labeled with family names, each containing maps of homesteads, financial summaries, correspondence, logs, and dates of departure or death. Some letters had been forged to appear, written by the departed. Others detailed precise strategies for estate claims and property transfer. The detail was chilling. What began as suspicion had now become undeniable. The Parker brothers had mapped out the entire county, not as a community, but as inventory. Targets, assets, opportunities. Then they found the room that changed everything. It wasn't just the documents or the goods. It was what should have been buried. Lockets clutched by children, wedding bands worn for decades, family photographs, even baptismal certificates, all stashed like discarded trinkets. No graves had held these. No ceremonies had honored them. These were not the leftovers of the dead. These were the evidence of murder. And yet, there were still no bodies, but the furnace was still warm. In the depths of the Kansas winter of 1900, in a land almost completely isolated by blizzards, a terrible truth was revealed. After weeks of surveillance, Dr. Hartwell and Miss Janet Thornfield finally witnessed the Kowalski family, a husband, wife, and 3 small children, being led into the Parker brothers' barn. The door then closed coldly, then locked. and from then on, no one saw them leave again. The tense hours passed. Aside from the howling wind outside, the only thing that did not stop was the furnace in the barn. It roared like a hungry beast, and the flames burned red all night long. Janet and Dr. Hartwell waited for dawn. But when the first rays of sunlight hit the snow, there was still no sign of the barn. They knew if they did not act now, they would never stand a chance again. Pause. Have you ever felt time stop because of fear? That was the feeling the investigation team faced that morning, February 23rd. Along with the villagers who were still brave enough, they went directly to confront Thomas Parker. He, as always, remained calm and cool. When asked about the Kowalski family, Thomas calmly replied that they had been transferred to Junction City because they were suffering from colds and malnutrition. He also showed papers and documents explaining that all actions were for the community's benefit. But then Dr. Hartwell noticed on Thomas's coat there were faint blood stains. When questioned, Thomas replied that he had just killed livestock for food. But Hartwell, with his experience as a doctor, immediately recognized it was human blood. Sound of wind, whistling slow heartbeat. Janet didn't hesitate any longer. She asked to search the warehouse. Thomas refused, claiming that the inside contained toxic materials and was a risk of spreading disease. Refused, firm, cold, determined to not stop the investigation team, went to the only person left with legal representation in town, Deputy Sheriff Tom Brennan. At first he was skeptical, but after reviewing the records what Janet and the doctor had gathered, he fell silent, then stood up and said only one sentence, "Let's go." On February 25th, 1900, the warehouse door was finally broken open. Inside was a world that none of them had ever imagined. The warehouse was divided into separate sections. One contained hundreds of household items, clothes, toys, kitchenware, pictures, furniture, all meticulously recorded, numbered, and labeled like a large department store. A separate room held documents, land maps, letters, financial records, and even detailed personal notes about each family in the area. Who was alive? Who was sick? Who owned land? Who had money? To tell the truth, this was no ordinary murder. But what made everyone hold their breath was the incinerator area. The cast iron furnace had been modified to burn at extremely high temperatures, completely destroying organic matter. All around were grey ash, small pieces of broken bones, a few pieces of half-burned clothing, and a smell that no one wanted to recall. Dr. Hartwell collected samples of the ash and bone fragments to be tested. The conclusion was inescapable. The bones were human from many people of different ages, maybe dozens, maybe more than 100. In another locked room, they found children's toys, women's dresses, woolen hats, and scarves, all belonging to the Kowalski family. And then they discovered Samuel Parker's diary, a small yellowed notebook written in neat, mechanical handwriting. In it, Samuel recorded every murder, every twisted thought the Parker brothers had about so-called humanitarian services. They started with dying families, hungry, cold, hopeless. But gradually their target changed families with money, land, and value. They invited them in, claiming to help with an inheritance or news from a distant relative. Then when the victim entered, the door was locked. Inside, they were strangled or hit on the head to keep it quiet and bloodless. The incinerator would take care of the rest. The victims' belongings were sorted, the valuables sold, and the rest burned with the bodies. They also created fake documents, making it look like the family had left because of the weather or had gone to live with relatives elsewhere. Thomas Parker eventually pleaded guilty to save Samuel from the death penalty. He testified 47 families, about 200 people, died at their hands in just one winter. In Samuel's testimony, there was a sentence that haunted many people forever. At first, we found it difficult, but gradually death became neat. It was the solution to a long winter. The Parker brothers' trial became the most shocking case in Kansas history. The evidence was overwhelming. Confessions, diaries, human bones, witnesses, documents, forged records. Nothing could be denied. One was sentenced to death, the other to life in prison. The silence inside the warehouse was deceptive. Investigators expected theft, maybe fraud, but what they found was something far colder. The shelves were lined with family heirlooms, lockets still bearing photos of loved ones, Bibles with weathered notes, rings, brooches, and neatly folded children's clothing. These were not items families would have left behind. They were mementos meant to be passed down, not sold. Yet here they were, labeled, catalogued, appraised like goods in a merchant's storeroom. One crate was marked, High Resale Polish Family, Deck 3, and then came the furnace. Deep within the warehouse was a room modified beyond any reasonable purpose. Reinforced stone walls, scorched brickwork, and a furnace that had been grotesquely altered to burgeon at temperatures far beyond standard designs. Scattered around it, investigators found bone fragments, partially burned sleeves, charred human teeth. Dr. Hartwell, the medical examiner, was forced to admit the unspeakable. This was a human disposal site. The samples he collected upon further analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to dozens of different individuals, men, women, children. Some likely killed in recent weeks. They didn't just find evidence of murder, they found procedure. In a locked back room, investigators uncovered the belongings of the Kowalski family, including a small wooden train and a doll, still wrapped in a knitted scarf. The objects weren't abandoned. They were sorted, tagged, priced, prepared. It had all happened recently, but the most chilling discovery was found tucked under the mattress of the younger brother's bunk, a thick, weather-worn journal belonging to Samuel Parker. Let me pause here, dear listener, and prepare you, because what the journal contained was not panic or remorse or even denial. It was methodology. Samuel's writings laid bare the brothers' descent. It hadn't started with greed. According to him, it had begun with mercy, or so they told themselves. As winter swallowed the prairie and families began to vanish, the brothers developed what Samuel called a dignified transition system, their euphemism for euthanizing starving settlers and stripping their estates. They had rationalized it as efficient, humane, helpful even, and over time, profitable. The journal revealed how they refined their approach, luring targets under the guise of locating distant relatives, faking estate papers, offering wagon repairs during snow squalls. It all ended the same way: suffocation or blunt trauma, no blood. And into the furnace they went. By the time the blizzard season ended, the Parker brothers had exterminated 47 entire families, nearly 200 individuals, and incinerated most of the evidence. The official confession came weeks later when the pressure of public outcry and physical evidence left no other option. Thomas Parker, the elder brother, agreed to confess in exchange for sparing Samuel from execution. His statement was clinical, emotionless, but thorough. He described the selection process initially focusing on vulnerable families near death, then shifting toward healthier ones with more valuable assets. The more refined their operation became, the less hesitation they felt. Witnesses who survived interactions with the Parkers testified to seeing strange documents, unusual estate claims, or hearing screams muffled beneath wagon tarps. But few suspected the truth. Perhaps in the depths of that blizzard-choked winter, no one wanted to. The trial of the Parker brothers became one of the most widely followed court proceedings in Kansas history. Newspapers from Topeka to Chicago covered every gruesome detail: the bone fragments, the false papers, the cold reasoning. For criminologists, it became a landmark case, not just for its scale but for its structure. These weren't impulsive murderers. They were methodical, and that, perhaps, was what terrified the public most. Legal challenges delayed their sentencing. Jurisdictional debates, questions about the influence of the blizzard, and the destruction of physical evidence slowed the courts. But the verdicts held firm. Both brothers were sentenced to death. Still, Kansas had never seen a case quite like this. Who could be held responsible when so many systems failed? The storm, the town, the isolation. Hays, Kansas. The small settlement at the heart of the storm would never be the same. Nearly a third of its population had vanished. Families once thought to have fled for better prospects were now confirmed dead. Property deeds were a mess, many had been forged or lost. Years of litigation followed to unravel ownership. For the survivors, grief turned inward. Why hadn't they seen the signs? Why had no one asked more questions? Janet Thornfield, the boarding house operator who had first raised concerns, was hailed as a heroine. But privately, she struggled with guilt. She often said, "If I had spoken louder in November, maybe the Kowalskis would still be here." She lived until 1934, and every Christmas, she laid 47 white stones outside her window, one for each family lost. As for Dr. Hartwell, the ordeal marked him permanently. His medical notes from that winter are preserved in a university archive. Pages soaked in ink, shaky handwriting, fragmented thoughts. He continued to serve as Hays' town physician, but friends noted he never laughed again. The Parker case shaped more than just a small town's legacy. Law enforcement agencies began adopting new policies about record keeping and emergency oversight. Training academies used the brothers' case as a blueprint for how systemic killers could exploit chaos. Clergy warned of twisted morality cloaked in charity. But even today, the Parker name casts a long shadow. Despite Thomas Parker's confession of 47 families, some historians suspect the real number may be higher. At least a dozen other family disappearances were recorded in the region that winter. No proof linked them directly, but the possibility looms. Were there more furnaces? Was Hays just one stop in a longer journey of blood and snow? The brothers' past remains murky. Some claimed to have seen them in Missouri years earlier, associated with missing persons. Others believe they first began practicing their methods in Oregon Trail way stations. But no concrete evidence has ever emerged. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. That such evil, cold, organized rationale could come not from chaos, but from calculation. From two brothers who once handed out hot cider during town meetings, who prayed in church, who never raised suspicion until it was far too late. So next time when winter howls and the road disappears in white, remember Hayes. Remember the Parker furnace and ask yourself who's keeping records when no one's watching. Our soft music fades in. We hope you found this tale haunting and thought-provoking. If you'd like to explore more forgotten crimes and chilling mysteries, consider subscribing to Sleepy History Tales. We whisper the past back to life so you don't forget what time tried to bury. Until next time, keep a candle lit. At trial in mid-1900, the truth finally emerged, the horrific scale of the crimes, the twisted psychology that had allowed the Parker brothers to commit a series of systematic and ruthless murders. Both Thomas and Samuel were sentenced to death. But the legal journey was not simple. Jurisdictional issues, the harsh weather of the fateful winter, and the lack of evidence due to the destruction of most of the property and bodies in the furnace all made it difficult to achieve complete justice. The horror story quickly spread throughout Kansas and neighboring states. Newspapers from St. Louis to Topeka chronicled each hearing, each witness. Many legal scholars and forensic psychologists began to study the case as a case of organized crime committed by individuals. With more than 47 families murdered, the elaborate methods and the ability to manipulate public trust, the case became one of the most brutal and well-documented crimes in American criminal history. But what made the case especially painful were the lasting effects on the Hayes community. The disappearance of dozens of families left not only a demographic gap, but also a broken land record system. The fraudulently titled properties led to dozens of lawsuits that dragged on for years. Some Hayes residents began to blame themselves for not noticing the strange signs from the brothers. Others fell into depression, tormented by the question, how did we let this happen right in front of us? Some never forgot. Dr. Hartwell, who had performed the first autopsy at the warehouse, continued to practice in Hayes. But his diary entries from 1900 reveal a man struggling with the darkness in his mind. I never imagined that evil could come in the form of an acquaintance, that it would shake my hand every morning and say a kind word. As for Janet Thornfield, the landlady who first suspected the Parkers, she was seen as the town's unsung hero. But for the rest of her life, she would say, I wish I had spoken up sooner. She lived until 1934, never missing a community meeting and meticulously recording every incident that occurred in Hayes. In a way, she spent the rest of her life guarding the conscience of the town. This story has been taught in many police academies and law schools as a hard-won lesson about community, trust oversight loopholes, and the consequences of society trusting appearances too much. And you know what? More than a century later, much remains unknown. What Thomas Parker has revealed, 47 families, may be only a fraction. Many missing persons records date back to the murders, but it is impossible to determine whether they died, fled, or were wiped out by the brothers themselves. There are families whose last trace is an unsent letter or a hastily sold piece of property. And then, in March 1901, when a group of workers were renovating the basement of the old Methodist church, they discovered a wooden chest hidden in the floor. Inside were not only jewelry, family photos, crosses, and children's dolls, but also a strange leather notebook filled with cryptographic symbols. It took investigators months to decipher the code, and when they did, a terrible truth emerged. The Parker brothers had not only killed in the winter of 1899 or 1900. The notebook revealed that they had begun in 1897. Over the previous 2 winters, they had experimented. The first 15 families, mostly newcomers, were quietly eliminated. Thomas described the victims as burdens on society, claiming that they were purging their race, a dangerous fallacy that has been repeated throughout history. Samuel was more practical notes on how to optimize processes, reduce costs, increase profits. They even experimented with their methods of killing. They started with pesticides, then switched to asphyxiation and blunt blows to the head, all methods that left little trace. The final pages of the notebook sent shivers down the investigators' spines. It's no longer work, it's progress. It's not crime, it's a natural duty. The notebook is on display at the Kansas State Judicial Museum today, still with the smell of leather and the faint blood stains at the edges. And you know what? Down there in the basement, there was a small inscription carved into the wood with a fingernail or a key knife. No one was sure. They didn't let me live, but I left a voice. The revelation that the Parker brothers had been systematically eliminating families for at least 3 years before their capture shattered any lingering hope that the tragedy was a one-time aberration. Investigators now estimated that the true number of victims might have exceeded 300, a staggering death toll that would make the Parkers' spree one of the largest, most chilling cases of serial murder in American history. As the news spread, more people stepped forward, some driven by guilt, others by a need to make sense of memories that suddenly took on a more sinister tone. Between 1901 and 1903, state investigators collected dozens of testimonies from residents across Kansas. The emerging picture was clear. This wasn't simply a story of 2 men exploiting a harsh winter. It was a finely tuned criminal machine that had been operating in quiet precision, right under the noses of the people of Hayes. Among the most haunting testimonies came from Margaret Kowalski, the sole surviving member of the family that Dr. Hartwell and Janet Thornfield had seen being taken to the warehouse in the dead of winter. Margaret hadn't been there. That night she had been visiting relatives in Junction City when her entire family vanished. She returned in the spring of 1900 only to be told they had died of exposure. But Margaret knew something wasn't right. She recounted how the Parker brothers had been visiting her family throughout the fall of 1899. Always helpful, always courteous. They brought supplies. They checked on the children. They offered winter fuel. What her family didn't know was that the fuel had been deliberately contaminated, engineered to burn poorly, leaving them dependent on the Parkers for heat. At the same time, rumors began spreading through Hayes that the Kowalskis had contracted a contagious illness. Visitors stopped coming. Offers of help vanished. The family was quietly isolated. Margaret's testimony revealed an even more disturbing pattern. The brothers had been using small sublethal doses of arsenic, a common agricultural poison, to weaken families over time. The symptoms mimicked disease and fatigue. It made the eventual deaths seem like the natural toll of winter. But those sick families lured to the warehouse under the pretense of medical help or warm shelter were never seen again. Another damning voice emerged from within the brothers' own circle. Henry Kellerman, brother of the late Mary Kellerman, came forward with a burden he could no longer carry. He had briefly worked for the Parker brothers during the winter of 1899, believing he was helping with estate clearing services. He hadn't seen anything explicitly violent, but in retrospect, the things he had witnessed haunted him. Henry remembered assisting in the sorting of possessions from families the Parkers claimed had perished. Jewelry documents and especially photographs were carefully scrutinized, catalogued, and if deemed dangerous, burned in the furnace. Family Bibles and letters were destroyed. Sentimental items were discarded. Only valuables remained. But it was the language the brothers used that chilled him. Victims weren't names, they were plots, yields, assets. Thomas, the more philosophical of the two, often praised their efficiency. Samuel was colder, calculating, obsessed with covering tracks. Henry recalled carrying bundles to the furnace items he assumed were bedding or old clothes. Now he believed they were something else entirely. Human remains. The brothers had developed methods to eliminate every trace. Bone fragments were pulverized and mixed with ash. Clothing buttons melted. Hair and teeth vaporized in the intense heat of the modified kiln. They had turned their warehouse into a machine for erasure. The full scale of the crime shattered the community of Hayes. Prayer services were held nightly. Schools closed for mourning. Church leaders held emergency meetings. How, the people asked, could such evil go unnoticed? Had they chosen not to see? Were there signs they had ignored out of convenience or trust? Reverend William Hartwell, brother of Dr. Hartwell, delivered a series of sermons at the Methodist Church. He did not offer comfort. Instead, he spoke of vigilance of the rot that can grow behind the most respectable doors. He warned of evil that whispers kindly and shakes your hand. For 3 years, the Parker brothers had lived among their neighbors, dined at their tables, helped bury their children, and all the while, they were planning poisoning and perfecting a system that turned cold weather into cover and trust into a weapon. The sermons delivered by Reverend Hartwell, preserved today in the dusty archives of the Hayes Methodist Church, offer a raw, unfiltered look at how one deeply religious frontier town tried to reconcile with the knowledge that monstrous evil had been living among them, smiling, praying, and shaking their hands. But the horror wasn't just spiritual, it was also economic. The Parker brothers had quietly amassed a sprawling portfolio of stolen land-forged deeds and liquidated heirlooms. The financial footprint of their crimes rippled far beyond Hayes, infecting counties across Kansas. Families that had lost everything in the winter of 1900 soon discovered they had also lost their homes, their farmland, their birthrights. Much of it had been sold under false names, often to legitimate buyers who had no idea they were purchasing the spoils of murder. Legal battles stretched for years. Entire homesteads remained locked in probate limbo. In some cases, rightful heirs had died by the time the land was restored, if it ever was. The Parker brothers had created not only a death toll, but a legal fog. A bureaucratic echo of their crimes that haunted survivors for decades. And yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Parker case wasn't the body count or the lawsuits. It was the awakening. The illusion that frontier life was protected by its intimacy, by its neighborly trust, was shattered. Across the American West, other towns watched the Hayes tragedy unfold with growing unease. If the Parkers could do this, who else might be hiding behind a pleasant smile and a warm meal? By 1902, Kansas and several neighboring states had begun to draft and implement a new set of rural safety policies. These included requiring multiple witnesses for any death certification, mandating medical autopsies before burials in isolated communities, documenting property transfers with rigorous transparency, and establishing registries to track population shifts and sudden family disappearances. These measures, soon dubbed the Parker Protocols, became standard in many Western states and remained in use well into the mid-20th century. For the first time, systemic murder was being treated not as an aberration but as a structural threat that demanded structural safeguards. But the Parker story also drew attention from another frontier, the frontier of the human mind. In 1903, Dr. Hamilton Craig, an alienist at the University of Kansas and one of the earliest scholars of criminal psychology, began a years-long investigation into the brothers. He interviewed surviving witnesses. He pored over their journals. He even reviewed testimonies from townspeople who had once admired or employed the brothers. His final report, published in 1904, became one of the first formal psychological profiles of what we now call systematic serial killers. According to Dr. Craig, both Thomas and Samuel Parker displayed every hallmark of psychopathic behavior, though the term had not yet entered medical consensus. They lacked empathy. They demonstrated extreme emotional detachment. And most alarmingly, they possessed adaptive intelligence, the ability to learn, refine, and evolve their crimes over time. Thomas was reflective, philosophical. Samuel was mechanical, cold. Together, they had engineered a logic, a shared delusion in which they believed they were serving society. They saw their victims not as people, but as burdens on a fragile system. In their own words, they were clearing the slate, thinning the herd, salvaging what could be saved. It was a moral inversion so complete, so eerily rational, that it allowed them to kill with conviction. Early journal entries contained faint signs of guilt, lingering questions about whether God would forgive them. But as time passed, those doubts vanished. Their writings grew clinical, detached, proud. Dr. Craig's analysis concluded that their ability to maintain positive self-images while committing acts of mass murder was one of the most dangerous forms of psychological manipulation known at the time. His work would go on to influence law enforcement training across the country and laid the groundwork for what we now recognize as behavioral profiling. But just when Hayes believed the full truth had finally emerged, another horror waited in the wings. In 1907, 7 years after the brothers' execution, a group of workers tearing down an old barn on the outskirts of Hayes discovered something buried within the structure. Behind a false wall, they uncovered a hidden chamber, painstakingly concealed beneath layers of brick and timber. Inside was a grim museum. Dozens of shelves lined the chamber's walls, stacked with hundreds of personal artifacts. There were photographs, some singed by fire, but still recognizable. Wedding rings, locks of hair, children's toys, Bibles, and diaries. Entire family histories preserved in eerie silence. It was the Parker brothers' private archive, a trophy room of the vanished. Some items matched belongings already listed in missing persons reports. Others revealed new victims who had never been connected to the case. Still others bore names no one in Hayes recognized at all, suggesting the brothers' reach may have extended further than even the most dire estimates. And the worst part, each item was carefully labeled, catalogued, numbered, as if the brothers hadn't just stolen lives, but had curated them. The sermons left behind in the dusty archives of the old church tell us more than doctrine. They speak of a community in shock, struggling to reconcile the horrors they'd unknowingly lived beside. Hayes had been devoured from within, and now it had to pick up the scattered bones of its innocence. But the legacy of the Parker brothers wasn't just emotional. It was economic, legal, and deeply structural. You see, over the course of 3 years, the brothers had fraudulently seized enormous amounts of property. Land, homes, livestock, tools, stripping families bare, then disappearing them into the frost. When the killing stopped, the paper trail began. Ownership deeds forged, signatures falsified. The Parker name popped up in places it never should have, holding title to land that no longer had living heirs, at least not ones above ground. For years afterward, survivors and their families fought bitter court battles to reclaim what was stolen. Some never succeeded. Generational farms lost, family homes auctioned to strangers. The brothers' crimes had left a phantom imprint on the land itself, and it didn't go unnoticed beyond Kansas. Other frontier towns looked at Hayes and asked, could it happen here too? Because Hayes wasn't some lawless outpost. It was a quiet place of trust and routine, where a handshake meant more than paperwork. And that's exactly what the Parkers had exploited. Soon, sweeping reforms followed. New laws mandated that estate services couldn't operate without oversight. Rural deaths now required not one, but multiple witness confirmations. All bodies had to undergo examination before burial. Transfers of land and assets were to be documented meticulously with new paper trails that would be much harder to forge or burn away. These changes were collectively known as the Parker Protocols. And they didn't just reshape Kansas, they were adopted across much of the western frontier. But the story didn't end there. The Parker case drew the interest of a rising field criminal psychology. One man, Dr. Hamilton Craig, an alienist from the University of Kansas, became obsessed with understanding why these brothers killed and how they had concealed their evil so effectively. Dr. Craig interviewed every surviving witness he could find. He pored through the brothers' confiscated letters and notes, trying to chart their descent. And what he found was chilling. In 1904, he published his conclusions. The Parker brothers exhibited what we would now call psychopathy, a total lack of empathy. Victims were not people, they were resources. Their manipulative charm, their calculated calm, their ability to mimic kindness, while orchestrating death, it all pointed to a deeply rooted, shared delusion. According to Craig, the Parkers didn't see themselves as villains. No, they believed they were doing good. In their own words, they were releasing families from the slow, cruel deaths of exposure and starvation. Mercy killings, they wrote, practical pruning, as if their neighbors were crops to be culled. Early writings showed flickers of guilt, but later entries were utterly detached, as if they'd been killing livestock. Through repetition and rationalization, they had completely dehumanized their victims and perhaps themselves. This profile, dark as it was, laid the groundwork for future criminal profiling methods. It gave lawmen and psychologists alike a blueprint for understanding serial murder, not as madness, but as a pattern. But just when the horror seemed fully charted, another revelation surfaced. 7 years after the execution in 1907, workers began tearing down an old barn outside Hayes. The structure had belonged to the Parkers. Hidden behind a false wall in the foundation, they found something unexpected, a sealed chamber. What lay inside defied belief. It was not just a storage room, it was a museum of death. Hundreds of personal items, necklaces, lockets, torn pages of Bibles, baby shoes, family portraits, all organized, labeled, displayed. This wasn't chaos. This was ritual. And that wasn't all. Tucked in the far corner were maps. Hand-drawn, detailed, and coded. They revealed burial sites scattered across the prairie, places no one had ever searched. Investigators guided by those maps unearthed 17 additional graves. Inside them, 43 more bodies. The conclusion was grim. The furnace hadn't been their only disposal method. In earlier years, they buried bodies in secluded spots, each grave marked in their secret atlas of horror. And the difference in those graves, it spoke volumes. The early victims had been arranged with care, perhaps even reverence. But in the final sites, bodies were dumped limbs, askew, shallowly covered, sometimes intermingled. It was as though the brothers had abandoned all illusion of dignity. They weren't saving anymore. They were consuming. With the final body count surpassing 400, the Parker case became one of the worst serial murder sprees in human history. And it left scars, legal, psychological, and generational. Lawmakers passed sweeping reforms to property fraud enforcement. Investigators overhauled their documentation protocols. The very structure of how death, inheritance, and ownership were verified in rural America shifted in response to 2 brothers from Kansas. Even more importantly, it shaped how we talk about evil, because the Parkers weren't raving lunatics. They weren't frothing monsters. They were polite, quiet. They led prayer circles. They hosted town socials, and they systematically slaughtered entire bloodlines under the cover of snowstorms. Their story now lives in police training manuals, in criminal psychology textbooks, in forensic seminars. And it lives in the DNA of a town forever changed. Hayes, Kansas never fully recovered. Many survivors moved away. Those who stayed created new memorials, new rituals. A quiet park now stands where the Parker warehouse once loomed. Their stone markers hold the names of families who vanished. Informational plaques urge visitors to remain vigilant, not just against evil, but against the blind trust that allows evil to bloom. Still, questions linger. No one knows how many truly died. The brothers' journals were incomplete. Many records were lost or destroyed. Some suspect that other sites may still lie, undiscovered graves no one has yet found. The true toll may forever remain a shadow in history. And what of the brothers' past? Even after exhaustive investigation, no one could determine with certainty whether they had killed before arriving in Kansas. There were rumors, disappearances in other towns, inconsistencies in their old stories, but nothing concrete. Were the Kansas murders their beginning, or simply the climax of a longer, darker career? The Parker brothers remind us of something hard to swallow, that monstrous acts can be committed by men who smile at you in the market, who shake your hand at church, who speak kindly to your children. So, dear listener, if you ever find yourself in haze on a winter evening and you walk the path through the memorial park, feel the wind across the tall grass and read the names on the stones, you might feel something else too. Not fear, but a deep, aching silence. The kind that remembers. Inside the final room of the Parker warehouse, investigators discovered a macabre collection of artifacts arranged with eerie precision, as if the brothers had built a separate shrine to their crimes. Not just personal items or looted property, but maps. Detailed maps showing the locations of dozens of unmarked graves scattered throughout the area. These documents revealed something shocking. Not all the bodies had been burned in the kiln. Many of the victims had been buried in remote locations with secret markers that the Parker brothers had left as if to return to later. Using that map, police tracked down 17 other burial sites where they unearthed 43 bodies. It was the moment the truth became undeniable. The brothers had not killed in a short period of time. They had killed continuously for 4 years, eliminating one family at a time for more than 400 victims in all. That makes their case one of the largest serial killings in human history. Forensic analysis revealed another horrifying fact. The first burials seemed conscious. The bodies were neatly laid out, covered with blankets. But the graves that followed showed a complete loss of humanity. Bodies were thrown haphazardly. Burials were crude. The Parker brothers had slid down the moral abyss, layer by layer. The impact of this case went far beyond the town of Hayes. It became an earthquake that shook the entire American legal system. Prosecutors faced a web of forged documents, fraudulent transfers of property, and blood-earned profits. And the system of property and wills was reformed nationwide. Criminal investigation was also transformed. For the first time in history, people saw the power of community cooperation in solving crimes. It was the Hayes people, not the detectives, who first asked questions, followed, and finally confronted. The initial psychological analysis of the brothers by Dr. Craig became the foundation for the later field of criminal profiling. The insights from the Parker case were taught in police schools as a lesson in how killers can live among us. Behind a kind face, behind polite words. The town of Hayes was never the same. Nearly a third of the population disappeared in that silent winter. Many survivors carried guilt for trusting too easily, for not being suspicious sooner. To commemorate them, the people established Memorial Park on the site of the Parker warehouse. It is not just a memorial, but an educational center, a reminder to future generations that not everyone is who they seem. Not all mysteries are solved though. The actual number of victims may be much higher because some of the records were destroyed. There are signs that the brothers operated in other states before coming to Kansas, but the evidence is fragile. The big question remains, when did they start? And perhaps the deeper question, how could two people lead two lives? One, a trustworthy neighbor, the other, a shadowy destroyer. They smiled at funerals, shook hands at church, and then a few days later turned the victims' families into ash. Was it the devil in human form, or was it society with its easy trust that helped them manifest? The winter of 1899 was the coldest in Kansas history. But the cold the Parkers unleashed went much deeper. It chilled the hearts. It froze trust, friendliness, and community spirit. What they burned in the furnace, it wasn't just wood. It is the life, the dignity, the faith that has held a small town together for generations. And so this story is not just a warning about evil, but also a testament to the power of courage and awareness. People like Janet Thornfield, like Dr. Hartwell, don't wait for someone to rescue them, they act. Amid the cold fog and ash, they see fire not just from chimneys, but from broken consciences. And today, more than a century later, the Parker case is still told in classrooms, in criminology books, and in cautionary tales for children. Because we are not completely safe. Because sometimes the truth is scarier than the myth. If you found this story to be creepy, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries as much as you do. Hit the like button to support Sleepy History Tales, and don't forget to subscribe because there are still many stories like this. What do you think about the Parker case? Has the truth been revealed, or are there victims whose names have never been mentioned? Leave a comment below, because you, the viewer, may be the one to continue the journey of justice for the souls who burned in silence. See you in the next video. If you found this story to be creepy, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries as much as you do. Hit the like button to support Sleepy History Tales, and don't forget to subscribe because there are still many stories like this. What do you think about the Parker case? Has the truth been revealed, or are there victims whose names have never been mentioned? Leave a comment below because you, the viewer, may be the one to continue the journey of justice for the souls who burned in silence. See you in the next video.